Okay, so this is a short video to run through some of the details with the management plan and how to fill it out. So what I've done is I've grabbed the last two new management plans that I've developed, and I think I can use them to illustrate a couple of key principles, and then I'm going to have those scanned and you'll see my kind of messy writing, but be able to go through and see how the flow of it is designed to work. So the first one is for a client of mine called Joe, and Joe has a long history of having recurrent lower back pain. He's had an MRI that shows an L5S1 bulge, and he's having some significant issues with lower back pain, and it's limiting him in terms of a number of his activities of daily living, in terms of him being able to sit for any length of time, etc., etc. So with the physical examination, the key findings that I've used within the PARTS framework are that he had a restricted joint motion as assessed by palpation of his left sacroiliac joint and his L5. He also had C5 subluxations, T3 subluxations, but in terms of tying in with his clinical symptomatic situation, the key findings are the L5 subluxation. So I used inclinometry to map out so that I'm plugging in as the A, or the asymmetry within the PARTS protocol. For his range of motion, I'm looking at what we need for you to have a loss of range of motion is an asymmetry. Now, interestingly, he had really good flexion. We looked for at least 110 degrees of lumbar flexion. He had 120. His extension was 38 degrees, which again is really good. But he had quite a marked asymmetry, so he could bend over to his right 58 degrees, but only 52 to the left. So from those two components, the asymmetry as determined by palpation and the loss of range of motion as determined by that asymmetry, I've developed a clinical impression of an L5 subluxation and associated myofascial hypertonicity, and it's complicated by his L5S1 disc bulge. So it's important that we put that in there, because once we know there's disc involvement, then the time frames that you'd expect for him to show improvement is likely to change. So then looking at outcomes, the ones that I'm tracking with him are his range of motion, his wellness survey. The one I'm going to focus on here though is that he did an FRI, and his FRI showed that as a score out of 40, he has a score out currently of 22. And the big issues there are in regard to length of time that he can sit and how consistently he's experiencing pain. So if we then flip those testing results into goals, which is really how we document the clinical need that he has for care, the goals over the next phase of his care is to improve his activities of daily living as measured by his FRI, reduce his pain, and improve his lumbar range of motion. Then we get into the management section of the management plan, and I've suggested that he comes in 3 times a week for the first 2 weeks and then twice a week for the 3 weeks after that. The other thing in terms of that, we're going to have him doing some postural exercises, and the expected time frame is 12 weeks, although we're scheduling a re-exam for after 6 weeks, I should say. So that's the end of Joe's management plan. We would then re-look at that 6-week mark. The next management plan that I want to go through is for a client of mine called Oliver. Oliver is an 11-year-old boy who's brought to see me. His mum was planning on getting him a checkup anyway, but recently he has been experiencing some pain, bilateral anterior thighs. At first she was saying, oh, maybe it's growing pains. We had a discussion around that often things that are reported as growing pains are actually subluxation related issues. So on his examination, again, if we look at our PARTS component, the clinical impression that I have with him is that he has a right sacroiliac subluxation and associated myofascial hypertonicity of his bilateral quads. So the clinical findings that we had there, again, within that the A or the asymmetry part, I'm supporting that through restricted joint motion of his right sacroiliac joint. He also we used with him the posture app to document the associated, and he had quite a marked postural distortion. So that's another, I guess, sort of outcome in terms of that asymmetry. In terms of his range of motion, he had his flexion and extension were quite good, but he had very asymmetrical lumbar range of motion where he could go 30 degrees to the left and 39 to the right. So that's really fulfilling that R component of the PARTS criteria. He also had, in terms of the T, the tissue texture, he had marked hypertonicity of his bilateral quads. So the outcomes that we're looking at with him, I measured his range of motion, his posture, and then we developed a patient-specific functional scale just through questioning him. He's limited in his running at an 8 out of 10. He really feels unable to run. He can't sit cross-legged at all, so he rated that as a 10 out of 10, and he's limited in his taekwondo as an 8 out of 10. I didn't do an FRI, so in terms of the goals that we've developed for him, to improve his PSFO, his patient-specific functional outcomes, so improve his ability to run, improve his ability to sit cross-legged, improve his ability to do his taekwondo, improve his lumbar range of motion, improve his posture. The management approach that I'm using is I've got him on a twice-a-week schedule for 6 weeks, and then we're going to give him some mirror image postural exercises, and the expected time frame is 6 to 12 weeks, but we're doing a review after 6 weeks of care, so after we've done those 12 visits. So I will scan these in. Any questions, just shoot me an email, and hopefully that helps you start to implement some management plans. Thanks.